Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the AI Files. I'm one of your co hosts, Shadab Hussain. We are so excited about this episode today because we have an eminent guest joining us today. His name is Imran Chaudhri, and he's a chief architect working at Progress, a company that specializes in data stores. And I had a privilege of working with him several years ago. We did some wonderful work together. He's also a highly passionate individual about the data, about the AI. He has been an entrepreneur. But before that, over to Jimmy.
Yeah, I would say good morning, Shadab, and good morning, everybody, as well. I'm actually super excited for today's episode and to get into the discussion with Imran. With that, I want to just remind everybody the views and opinions expressed here on this AI File show are ours from Shadab and myself, and not related to any views back to Microsoft. So with that legal mumbo jumbo out of the way, definitely want to bring Imran on the stage and have him introduce himself. Good morning,
Hell,
Imran.
Good
hey,
morning, guys. How are you?
Doing good, doing good.
doing good,
So
Imran. We would love to actually first have your introduction. Talk about yourself. What have you done? I know it's been a long list of achievement, but give us an idea, and then we will get started.
Sure. Really quickly, undergrad and work was from McGill. Graduate work was from Cornell. Double E as sort of was my major, but have always been programming since before high school, even. So I've been in the tech industry, if you count the before high school part, for quite a while. Over the I guess the first part of my career was a dozen different startups. The last one being teaching computers medicine by looking at private patient records and being able to figure out what's really wrong with patients. So the idea being that if you know what's wrong with the patients properly, you can treat them properly. And quite often, problem lists in electronic medical record systems are uh, wrong or have potential illnesses that weren't real illnesses, things like that, right? So cleaning that up is a really important thing for Medicare Advantage companies in particular. And so that company did really well, had a nice exit. And for the last 10 years, though, I've been part of Progress Software. And again, anything we talk about here is more my opinion, also, and not necessarily directly Progress Software's opinion. In Progress Software, I'm sort of the head architect for their Gen AI, healthcare, and life sciences spaces.
great. I think one of the sections we should add on when we do interview Shadab is to find out what machine did you start programming on? When you said you were doing coding in high school, that was kind of like my entryway into computers, and I remember programming on a Commodore 64 and an Atari
Yeah,
800. Back in
it
those
was
days.
an Atari 400 for me.
Yeah, that's too funny.
Yeah.
So you mentioned some of the things, as your role at Progress. Hey, can you expand a little bit in terms of the things that you see as key problems in the industry, whether it's in data as a whole or just Gen AI systems?
Right. One of the data as a whole has what I would call an information architecture problem in most companies. The problem that lives on the data side is that information architecture tends to be disjointed. People tend to buy applications, and those applications have their own databases. And then you have what I call application-driven data silos. You have potentially department-driven data silos. And you have a lot of these different kinds of data, not only structured data that's usually in a relational database, but there tends to be a lot of unstructured data as well. In the healthcare space, one of the key problems that exists with the unstructured data side is I used to work with a really good chief medical officer, and he said, Imran, I have buckets of dead documents, right? Because those documents are there, but nobody knows how to access them or how to find stuff in them or how to use them properly for the kinds of things you want. In the AI space, um, uh, getting access to good data, cleaning up that data, making that data fit for purpose tends to be a lot of work. In fact, data scientists tend to spend a lot of their time in the data cleaning and scrubbing phase of the project, as opposed to the actual
Yeah.
machine learning phase of the
I'm,
project.
I'm smiling because I just rolled off of doing some work with a customer, and 80% of that work was doing the data preparation, data cleansing, or doing the
That's right.
learning model.
That's absolutely right. And then in the Gen AI space, Gen AI has a lot of probabilistic response capabilities, which is great. But then it also mimics a lot of the kinds of problems that humans actually have in sort of our interaction with the world. In that, hallucinations, I'm sure everybody's heard of. That The ability to just make up stuff probabilistically that sounds right is perfectly fine thing to do because us humans do that all the time too. Actually, if you just look at any studies on memory and memory recall, you'll realize that memory is ever changing, shall we say, and every time you recall it, you actually do change your memory a little bit. Then there's also biases. There can be bias in the training data sets. There can be biases in sort of the algorithms that were used to select the training data sets and so on, right? There's the ability to actually do logic and reasoning and understanding. There's the fact that these systems take a year or two to get created, and so their sort of original understanding of the world is usually lagging by the real world by that amount of time. There's the fact that you really can't understand because these models are so large exactly why a decision is being made or exactly why a probabilistic word is being selected for the next output. And then there's also robustness. How do you uh, because these are now language-based systems, the attack surface of these systems is now getting larger and larger, and uh, there are lots of different ways to quote unquote trick the system into answering stuff that it shouldn't answer, or asking or giving it tasks that it probably shouldn't be doing, but you can trick it into doing them, right? So these are a lot of the major problems that Gen AI systems
I
face.
was about to say there's so many things you just touched upon. I'm like, I want to dig deep into each one of them. Um, uh, I guess maybe a first question that I have for you, just on that, you mentioned like things like dead data. By the way, I probably should have mentioned I used to work with the pharmaceutical industry for about 10 years. So, I've seen a lot of things from the research side to actually working in the field, and just understanding how that information works with doctors and everything else. So, but what intrigued me there, you mentioned things like dead data, like just not being able to get to some data information or sources. But maybe on the flip side of that, how do you determine what is good data, or at least data that should be used for whether or not it's in a Gen AI based system and or just to solve a problem? How do you look at that question first in terms of what do I even like put my arms around as it relates to data that I should be using?
Right. So that the way I would look at it is finding the right data is actually the really critical part of the puzzle here. And if you think about all of the generative AI problems that we just briefly touched on, right? Again, you could probably do a whole session on each one of them. Um, uh, I have this saying now that context is king. Uh, Basically, the idea here is that if you can provide the right context, you can reduce the identified problems of Gen AI systems by a lot, and the probability of them making a mistake or going down the wrong path goes down a lot. Just to give you an example, what I mean by context is, let's say we're talking about, and the first kind of stuff I did, like early last year, when we got access to GPT. was to put in a scenario. And in that scenario, I said, okay, I'm going to pretend to be a healthcare insurance company. And insurance companies have these policy documents that say this is allowed, this is covered, this is the disease, this is the procedure for that disease, and this is what we'll pay for, and how many visits are allowed, and those sorts of things, right? So um, uh, I basically crafted 3 different kinds of scenarios just to test and see what would happen amongst all 3 of those scenarios. First scenario was, hey, let's just ask ChatGPT the question and see what it says, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, I also, as soon as Anthropic came out, I started testing that pretty hard too, because it had a much larger context window. I'm like, okay, what can I stuff
Yeah.
into
What can I throw
into
in?
this thing,
Yep.
right? What I found was that for general questions, you got good answers. And like the first 5 questions I asked it along in that scenario were pretty general, like what is continuous glucose monitoring? And that turned out to be a perfectly fine answer, no matter what architecture I chose. But then as you push these things more and more towards deeper and deeper knowledge, that's when you start seeing differences in what it can respond and how well it can respond, and what kind of hallucinations it'll have. And in particular, so the first architecture is just ask, right? The second architecture we said is, okay, what if we give it private data into its token window or command prompt, and say, hey, here's this private data. We want you to answer only from this private data and not from something else. So that helps along a couple ways. One is, since we're quote unquote commanding it to go at just that private data, um, uh, it will make stuff up less of the time, because the private data is accurate and represents the company's interests and what the company wants to communicate to its users, right?
Mhm.
It also potentially can reduce bias. Like if you tell it basically, here's the 5 sets of studies that we want you to use to answer this particular medication question, then if the studies themselves are biased, you're out of luck, right?
Garbage
but
in,
but, but
garbage
at
out.
least at least you're trying to give it as close to the ground truth as possible, and telling it to use that ground truth, right? um, on the data cutoff side, if you have a transactional real-time updatable engine, then the best data can be provided as the highest priority. And in fact, I have lots of potential customers and customers that say, hey, Imran, I don't even want to give it the older data. I want to totally deprecate it because the newer data is replacing it and is more accurate, right?
Mhm.
And then also, if you can provide this reference data and say, this is the reference data I provided this digital brain, and then this is the answer that the digital brain gave, and you can log all that operational information, you have very strong ground for regulated environments, where you can say, hey, this is what we gave it, this is the answer. And potentially you can put a human in the loop and review that information too, right? If you really need to have that level of uh, uh, legal defensibility in your answer, right? um, so those are kinds of things that the context really helps with, right? Now the question is, how do you find the right data, right? So
Right.
getting back to your sort of question, and the answer is, depending on the question you have, you might want to use one of a half a dozen or a dozen different kinds of tools or capabilities to find the right data. If the data is structured, then it makes sense to do a SQL-like query against it. If the data is unstructured, then you have multiple types of strategies to find the right data. You have vector embedding models that can find you semantic or meaning from the question and map it to the data that you have. You have the ability to do just regular TF-IDF or BM25 type of search. You have the ability to look at a customized graph and figure out from that graph what's really important in the question. You have the ability to ask the Gen AI not the answer, but hey, here's the question. What's important in the question itself that we should use to figure out what we should get back to you to help you answer the question? You have the ability to look at co-occurrences across your whole data set and say, hey, among these 1 billion documents, here's this word that's occurring, and how often does it occur with this other word here? And oh, the most likely occurrences between these two words are pretty high. So maybe I'll search for not only the word that the user asked for, but also this other sort of related word that might mean a related concept. Even without creating a graph, you can do that kind of co-occurrence querying in real time. And then, of course, there's geospatial information that comes into the real world all the time. Like, I'm only interested in diseases in this particular country, right? And so on, right? So the idea here is if you have multiple tools in your toolbox, you should use all of those tools depending on what the kind of question is that you're asking and what your use cases are.
Yeah.
And that helps you find the right context.
Yeah, and I love the comment you made. It's about using, in some cases, use AI to help determine what might be the best data based upon that question set that you're looking for.
It's a little bit of a meta, but
Yeah.
it actually does help.
Yeah.
We've seen it boost reliability in our customers examples.
Imran, you talked about the tools, of course, the importance of tools, and talking about the tools and the platforms. You mentioned that you work at Progress, so tell us more about your Progress data platform and how does it support the customers in their journeys.
Sure. So the Progress data, just a real quick thing on Progress. Progress is a company that's been around for 40 years. They started off in 4GL databases, and they have grown through what I would call strategic acquisitions, where you look for a certain kind of company with a certain kind of product and grow it in that space. And Progress recently bought MarkLogic and Semaphore, which is the sort of products that I work with a lot. And the Progress data platform, the key cornerstone is the MarkLogic multi-model real-time transactional database. And then Semaphore is the layer on top that helps us extract knowledge and manage knowledge and graphs from our customers. You can think of this platform as not an AI system, but a system that, using semantics and understanding of the real world and real world concepts that can be extracted from subject matter experts in your company, to then help you find the right context. And when you find the right context, you can increase accuracy, increase trust, reduce the risk of things going off the rails, all those things that we just talked about earlier.
Okay.
Are there any things, I guess, that might be unique to the Progress data platform that you just mentioned? It sounds
Yeah.
very
So we have a couple of things that fall into the unique space. One is uh, for the first year of ChatGPT's journey, embedding vectors were the way to do semantics in finding the right data to feed the Gen AI. I would posit that those semantics that are created by vector databases are helpful and are automated and no human in the loop, but they are much smaller models than the large Gen AI models like 4.0 or o1 preview right now, right? That's out there, or Anthropic Claude. And because they are much smaller models, I think of these models as what I would call knowledge compression engines, lossy knowledge compression engines. Uh, even if you take the same data and put it in different models, the larger models will be able to answer more accurately with that same training data set than the smaller models. And because you're squeezing squeezing down the model to make it smaller and smaller, you are totally losing information and logic capabilities and reasoning capabilities as you do that. And sort of the uniqueness that we have is we're saying, next, you want to use those embedding models on 1 billion documents? Go for it, right? We'll totally support that. But the unique aspects are that we help customers very, very rapidly capture their subject matter expertise's knowledge into what we call knowledge graphs. And then we can reuse those knowledge graphs in the ways that we talked about to find the context and provide the really correct information to the Gen AI, which then helps with all of the problems that it has. So that's one aspect of it. We've got a couple of patent pending tech out there, and I'd mentioned using the Gen AI to figure out what might be important. Well, we're also using that same information to look at the knowledge graph and figure out, hey, does this concept already exist in that knowledge graph? If it does, great, do nothing, right? Just carry on the way you were. But if the concept doesn't exist, then we go, oh, let's see where in this knowledge graph this might fit. And then we can use GenAI in conjunction with the subject matter expert to put that new knowledge into the right spot in the graph so that the very next question in the 2 seconds later is able to be answered with that new knowledge that was just extracted essentially from the subject matter into this knowledge graph, right? So that's one aspect. It's basically using Gen AI and humans in what I would call a cyborg way, right? To really increase the productivity of the humans, and then also increase the productivity of the whole company by finding the right data. So that's step one. The other really interesting thing that we came across was a study that said, hey, if you use search on, and this is for a Stanford Squad 2 data set, which is about 20,000 questions and about 40,000, sorry, 20,000 paragraphs and about 40,000 questions that are trying to answer from that set of paragraphs. It's really, and the way the questions are set up, you can only answer from one paragraph. So it's really easy to tell if you got the right data back. And so they did a study on, well, let's just do regular search and see how well that works. And if you're only allowed one paragraph back, then it doesn't matter what tech you use. It's going to be wrong 1/3 of the time, right 2/3 of the time, but wrong 1/3 of the time, right? And by tech I mean vectors and or regular search, right? But if you were allowed yourself, say, the top 10, like maybe the first page of Google might look like in terms of a search retrieval, right? Then you can get 87% accuracy in that test for regular search, 85% for regular search, 87% for the vector-based search. So a little bit of a bump. But then if you combine the two together, you get 90%. So okay, that really led to, okay, combining things together gives you much better answers anyways. So why not use all the tools in your toolkit to help do that? With that sort of background in our heads, we're like, okay, if we can get you into the ballpark without vectors, then, and your users are only interested in about 10% of your data, then don't vectorize all of your data. Just do vectorization for the data that is important to your users. And so potentially think of it as a vector cache of your data, as opposed to having to vectorize all your data. And if your cache is running at 10% of your actual data, then you've cut your vectorization cost by 10x, right?
Right. Yeah.
Another really unique aspect of what we've done is when we get data back, let's say you get 50 chunks of data back, and really you need to take large documents and chop them into chunks so you can feed it into the tight context windows of these Gen AIs.
I was about to say, yeah. And that's a whole nother.
That's a whole nother
topic.
optimization, right? So we looked at that and we said, okay, so if we have 50 chunks of data, which have maybe 100 sentences each, so that might give us 5,000 sentences. Well, out of those 5,000 sentences, how many of those sentences actually have knowledge that's captured and deemed important by the organization? So if out of those 5,000 sentences, you only have 400 sentences that have knowledge in that space, then we have a sort of option where you can just go in and say, okay, filter by the sentences that are high in knowledge content, right? And then you present just that to the Gen AI as opposed to all 5,000 sentences. So that has a couple of, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like you're automating, or at least looking at a field that relates back to the human feedback loop.
100%. 100%. We're saying the humans in our current enterprises and current systems have a lot of knowledge, and leveraging that knowledge at scale using compute is the right way to turbocharge the Gen AI systems and get the right answers back.
I'm thinking about it as like a funnel. You have this large amount of data, but then how do you get back into something that's most appropriate, that's right, useful for everybody? And then, yeah, you still have that vast amount of data that might be used in some form or fashion, but you're streamlining and like targeting the amount of data or useful data that would be used within the Gen AI system.
Right. So like I said, we started off with the premise that context is king, and now we're taking the context and we're concentrating it down, right? So think of it as as starting off with coffee beans and then saying, I really want espresso freeze dried from here, right?
Right. Getting very specific. I guess maybe, with all that in mind and the things that you just mentioned and the types of work that's being done at Progress with the data platform, can you give any examples of, some of the customers and maybe some of the quote unquote gains or advantages that they've seen based upon, the work that you've been able to put together?
Yeah,
But
yeah,
actually, one thing, sorry, before that, before we move away from the topic, because
sure.
what you described, Imran, was really good. I just wanted you to also, you talked about knowledge graph particularly, right? Could you explain what the knowledge graph is for our audience?
Yeah, sure. Knowledge graphs were something that Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the internet, observed, and he observed that on the internet, humans were able to understand and process pages and go through links much more readily and much more easily than computers were able to do. And so he came up with a very simple way of capturing knowledge that would help the computers navigate the sort of wild west of unstructured and structured combinatorial data that's out there in the web in a reasonably reliable way. And it comes with three really basic components. There's a subject, there's a verb, and then there's an object. And really, it's something like Imran lives in Potomac. That would be one sort of node in the graph, right? And or one sort of relationship in the graph. So the new nodes are Imran and Potomac, right? So the two objects are Imran, which can then be expanded into Imran Chaudhri and so on and so on, right? And Potomac, which can then be saying have further relationships, like Potomac is a city in Maryland, right? So now, by having those two facts together, the computer can go, oh yeah, I can figure out that Imran lives in Maryland, right? And it's a much easier transition for a computer to do that kind of work than to look at a sentence and figure that out. Now with Gen AI, of course, the ability to do sort of the natural language part is getting much better, but uh, the the ability to traverse and calculate and search on this sort of compressed knowledge format, these graphs, is much less compute and power intensive than using Gen AI to do the same task. Like I said, by using less power, less compute, and yet still getting really good background data to feed to a Gen AI, you're improving the Gen AI's ability to do its job much better.
Thank you. Sorry, Jamie, I had to ask that question for our audience. Knowledge graph is an important topic, but back to Jamie's question now.
Sure. In terms of customer examples, we have a very large crop tech company in Europe that was only getting 50% accurate answers on in their use case. They test drove us. They hit 90% and said, "Good enough. Let's go into production with this level." We had a food tech company that is in a similar space. It's global, but headquartered in the U.S. And they just are wrapping up an eval of and literally Friday morning was when they sort of reported on the results. They said we had 200 questions of the data set that we were using. It was on an R&D data set, and they said the answers came back with 100% accuracy. So they did not get any hallucinated answers at all based on the platform that we put together. And to be fair, what they did is they prepped the data really well, in the sense of they took their document space, they extracted from that document space the key nouns and verbs that were automatically extracted by the semaphore program. And then they said we're going to use the IT technical experts to filter out this to a certain set of concepts. And then they took that to their subject matter experts and said, please further filter this down to the concepts of interest to you. And that's what they started off with, their knowledge graph. And with that knowledge graph, armed the 200 questions they asked, we were able to find the right data in their thousands of documents to give back to the Gen AI to answer properly. Also, another learning there was we found that the context window was really important. Obviously, if you can only return 3 chunks and you need 7 chunks to actually answer the question in a comprehensive manner, their sort of first iteration was 3 chunks, and the learning was that, hey, the answers are correct, but they are incomplete, right? And then we were able to test out and figure out, what the context window was and how much of the context window we could use for the prompting part. And we upped it from 3 to 25. And then this last quote was from Friday, which is, hey, now we're not getting incomplete answers anymore. The answers are accurate and complete. So that was a really good validation. A large global chemical company, also probably decades, or if not more than decades old, won't talk about their name, had data in our platform to begin with. They reached out to us like late last year and said, hey, how do we use Gen AI with this? And we just gave them reference code, and literally like by middle of January they were in production. So it is really easy, and the way to think about it is, because we had made our platform very easy for humans, by extending that with just a little bit of API and reference code, frameworks like LangChain or Llama Index or Spring AI, in support of that, we were able to extend this to pretty much any Gen AI out there, and allow those Gen AIs to get the right data to answer their questions as well. And then the last example that I have is really funny because it's one of the big four accounting firms. Again, can't name names. They tested us, and they realized that we were doing way better, and consider us their secret sauce and don't want us to use their name. But they are saving about $2 million a week with the implementation that they put in place, and they have. And it's due to increased efficiency. There's about 6,000 users on that system alone, right? Each of those 6,000 users is saving on average about 2 hours a week, which adds up to that $2 million a week very rapidly. So those are some really good examples of things that we've done. One other example that comes to mind, we started off with a really basic knowledge graph at another super large pharmaceutical company, and they had like 1,000 test documents. Some of the answers were coming back wrong, and we're like, okay, let's take a look at the question and the answer in the document. We looked at it and we're like, oh, you probably should add this note to your knowledge graph. We made that change, and the very next second the answer was coming back correct, right? So the agility of updating your graph to get the right kind of answers is part and parcel of what we bring to the table.
Awesome. Yeah. Kind of drawing upon like all those different experiences with those customers that you've seen, and obviously what you've been able to develop and push out there as it relates to the Progress Data Platform. I'd like to have you put on your all-seeing in the future hat on, if you will. But since you've seen so much, like what do you believe are the trends going into next year around data management and AI? Any early predictions? Other than telling me what the Powerball numbers may be, but any early predictions going into next year?
Sure. I guess I do a lot of research, listen to a lot of podcasts, watch a lot of YouTube videos, right? Because that's the only way to keep up right now. Even read publications, research papers on ARIX or whatever they call it, right? But one thing
You're
that's
suggesting people should really listen every week, regularly, every episode of the AI Files to keep up.
yeah.
That's what it is. Okay.
I've listened to a couple of these podcasts too, right? So you're in my list now. I am subscribed. But one thing that Gartner came up with in summer of this year, was they expect at least 30% of Gen AI projects to fail between now and the end of next year. And the rationale I'm using the word at least 30%. My take on it is I suspect it'll be closer to 50%, if not more. And And the rationale they put there was that it's because the data quality is not good enough, because the risks and the costs were not addressed properly. That leads to very questionable business value and ROI. And in businesses, you have to start thinking along the ROI space extremely carefully and understanding what value is this going to bring to the table. Like the big four accounting firm is seeing a super real ROI, right? But the what it boils down to is you need an agile, flexible data platform and a knowledge graph platform that can change with your growing understanding of the use cases that are being used. And if you have the ability to change very, very rapidly, and every 2 weeks have a new iteration, and have the ability to increase your reliability, your trustworthiness, your transparency of your answers, then you are on a track towards success. And that's been a really sort of insightful thing for us, especially with working with our key large customers, to see that we can make a difference, and we can make a difference very rapidly. Like within 2 weeks, we can have something up and running. Within a month, we can have something running pretty well, and then it's just a matter of cranking up the precision and accuracy to get the level of reliability that you need to reduce your legal liability risk or increase your business value.
Yep. Yeah.
So, Imran, yeah, sorry,
I
go
was
ahead.
gonna say, yeah, some of the things you just mentioned certainly hit home. Working here at Microsoft and working with a large number of organizations, they had this knee-jerk reaction. Oh my God, I have to do something in generative AI, but not necessarily put thought around, what's the real business value that they wanted to derive out of that, let alone the data. I mean, everything you just mentioned about data is super spot on. The other things too is that in some cases they don't necessarily train the people on how to actually use those pieces. So I definitely agree with you. 30% is probably low in my opinion as well. Probably, at 50, if not maybe a little bit more. And, our jobs really are to, pinpoint all of those different things, right data, right type of training, and what's the real business value out of it.
Yeah,
So
I think it requires much more planning and preparation because otherwise, that this famous term like death by 1,000 POCs, and lots of POCs fail, and then everybody say it doesn't work. Well, it does work. The problem is you didn't work, right? I mean, so it's more than the technology, it was a human part which was a failure, right? But people generally blame it on the models and the technology. That becomes a problem. But anyway. But I just wanted to move on to the next question, particularly related to the healthcare and the life sciences, Imran. This is what something that I think all three of us have worked in the past or currently. And, it has a little bit of a different kind of context because it has tons of data, a lot of diversity of data, really industry flush with the data, but then also a lot of that data, as you talked about in the beginning, right? Unreachable, inaccessible, a lot of regulatory data, privacy sensitive. It becomes difficult. Um, so, however, it is also the one of the fastest, or probably the fastest industry by the GDP to in growth. Is it ready for the AI, or as usual, like it has done in the past? Is it going to be the last and wait and watch and then only make a move?
So I would say, this sort of brings up another maxim of mine, which is great AI requires great IA. And when I say IA, I mean information architecture. So there are in the healthcare and life sciences spaces, especially in the life sciences spaces, people are willing to spend a decent amount of effort and resources on creating an information architecture that can grow and scale and change. In the healthcare space, I think the payer space has a really good handle on information architecture and the need to apply resources there. In the provider space, I would say certain large provider organizations are heading down that path, but smaller organizations have been struggling and typically are 10 to 20 years behind the times, which is one of the reasons why I early on decided to do startups in the healthcare space, because I'm like, Oh, I know what's happening in that sort of vertical. We should totally do that over here because nobody's doing it over here. Right? What I would say is the healthcare organizations that are spending the effort to put in good information architecture are ready for taking advantage of Gen AI. The ones that are not, data is the foundation of your solutions. If you don't have a good foundation, you're not going to be able to build a good house on top of it.
But given the amount of mergers and acquisitions and those kind of activities in this industry is probably one of the highest, and that does whenever that happens, that does shake up your IA, right? I mean, the information architecture goes for a toss when the two large, completely disparate organizations keep meeting. How do you keep up then? And isn't it that you see as a main problem in this industry? That's why they make progress and then they actually regress.
Yeah, I would say so. Platforms like the Progress Data Platform lets you take multiple disparate data sets and make them look the same very, very rapidly, not through coding, not through custom code, but actually through configuring to say, hey, here's this data. I want you to run it to these three functions with this kind of a parameter to get this version of it out there, right? So a really quick example in the healthcare space, patients typically have some kind of a gender, and depending on the data application that created it, it might be 012, it might be MFO, it might be male, female, other, right? The ability to take that, combine it with a very simple vocabulary, and say, hey, coming in this way, use this lookup table to get male, female, other for this data set for this parameter. And oh, by the way, this parameter is called gender in the source system, but I really want sex in the final system. Not only change the label, but also change the content of that based on some very rapid configuration capabilities. Um, uh, Being able to do that in a very iterative fashion and clean up your data as you need, only for the data set you need to do for your use case, so that you get end-to-end capabilities going, is something that can help these companies very rapidly put together data sets that and again, it boils back down to good information architecture, right? So if you have the information architecture that gives you data agility along with programmatic agility or delivery agility, then you're in a good spot.
I was going to take it to one other question for us. Now, you just obviously talked about where healthcare can use AI. You talked a little bit about trends that you're seeing. I'd like to maybe come back to maybe your thoughts on where AI as a whole is actually heading. There's obviously a lot of talk around artificial general intelligence, maybe some of the things that you just mentioned around or mentioned a little bit earlier around knowledge graphs and maybe potential use of GraphRag um, in being able to use in conjunction with AI. But take that two steps back. Like where are we heading? Like what's your thought maybe on some of the pathways and the things that you see or maybe think we're heading as a whole over the next, I'll call it 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, maybe 5 years down the road.
So sounds good. So one graph that I recently saw, and I've seen it like multiple times now. It's a log graph around capabilities. Actually, it's a log graph on the vertical axis, and it's sort of a very linear graph on the timescales. And if you look at these Gen AI systems 6 years ago, they were at pre-kindergarten capabilities. 3 years ago, they were at kindergarten capabilities. Now they're at sort of the high school, early college stage capabilities. And actually, with release of O1 preview, they're now in certain areas for certain specific use cases hitting PhD level capabilities. The idea that a general purpose model can do PhD level capabilities in addition to sort of the general everyday interaction and understanding of the real world is only 2 to 4 years away. My guess is closer to 2 than 4. The other thing to think about is us humans. We're limited by the sort of compute power that's in our heads and sort of the compute neuron capacity that's in our heads. We can't expand beyond that. These Gen AI systems don't have that limitation. So the ability to go larger and bigger and faster, or get more efficient at model processing, or get more efficient at understanding how to do introspection and take a little bit of time before you give the answer. Things like that are increasing. So not only are our algorithms getting better, but our compute is getting faster and better. I totally see going to artificial superintelligence very much in the next 5 years or beyond, right? But not much longer than that. And then then that brings up a question of self-awareness and uh, whether you are actually self-aware, or whether you can simulate self-awareness good enough that you can't tell the difference between this thing is really self-aware or not. I don't know. I don't know if it makes a difference, honestly. Um, Even as recently as 6 months ago, there was a really interesting article about a test that was done on Claude. They gave it a super large document, and in the middle of it, they put some really small amount of data that was totally unrelated to the super large document. And then they asked it about the unrelated data, and Claude answered the answer correctly and said, and I think this is a specific question designed to test my capabilities.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. The
Um,
needle in the haystack, right? Like
yeah, exactly. Right. So it, at a minimum, we know that Claude is beginning to simulate self-awareness.
yeah,
Right. And so my take on these things is these things are hacking our 5,000-year-old human operating system. Um, all of our legal constructs, all of our structures on what is correct to do, what is allowed to do, what is moral or ethical to do, is based on language. And these things are now able to at least process that. I don't know about understanding it per se, but at least able to process it. Um, uh, the 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 way I look at it is right now they are still children, and I've raised 5 kids, and uh, at some point those kids become teenagers, and all bets are off. You cannot communicate with them. They become what I call alien intelligences of some kind, and that's a good way to think about artificial intelligence systems too. I've heard the term alien intelligence battered around a lot. It's not. It's not. It's just different from a human brain, right? But my take on this is the time to teach these things about ethics and morals and create data sets that help them be aligned with doing good and being good is now. And really, you want to catch them while they're children as opposed to when they're teenagers. And so, to that extent, I've actually started a nonprofit called Quran AI to extract good data sets for these systems to have available in an open source sort of way. Um, the other thing to think about is that as these capabilities become really advanced, um, just like humans, we have the ability to do really good things, but we also have the ability to do really bad things, right? Um, in the short term, the key danger that we face is not necessarily from an AI going rogue, but from rogue humans using AI in harmful or dangerous ways. Um, and so we absolutely need to think about at the corporate level, at the government level, um, responsible and ethical AI, and the ability to make sure that we provide these systems with instructions and examples of how to do responsible AI, so that they not only try to give the answer that the user is asking for, but also keep that in the context of being good, being harmless and helpful, and those sorts of things. And honestly, if you ask me, I think the large corporations don't spend enough time on it. I think they are aware of it and they are spending time on it, but not as much as they should. It's kind of like it's kind of like security in the old days on the networking side, and security on data in general, or intellectual property in general, is that you don't realize how critical it is until you have a breach,
Right.
and then you go, oh man, we got to spend a lot of resources and effort in this space in order to make these things safer, right?
Yep.
Um, and
Mhm.
if I have a message to sort of my audience, it would be, hey, be sure in your testing and your POCs to think about the ethical and responsible uses of it. Be sure to think about what can go wrong. Be sure to allocate resources and budget towards what I call AI level firewalls, right? So because your input is now natural language, you need a firewall here that can start protecting your AI solutions from natural language attacks, right?
Yep.
So those are sort of long-term thoughts that I've got for
Uh,
customers.
that's definitely a lot to think about, and a lot of good insight. The thing that scared me the most is where you said ASI might be within like 4+ years from now. Starting to think like Skynet's going to be coming soon, but well,
Mm.
we'll hold that for another thought.
For all its gloom, it would still be exciting to see something, like of a Skynet. But I think I've generally found that humans ultimately come through. They figure out a way. We have always done, and as long as we have the right moves at the right time, right people in the right places, I think humanity will figure it out.
Yeah, I'm an optimist. I think there is both great potential here and great harm possibilities, but I think with any technology, if you can shape it properly, you can get it in moving in the right direction.
That's true. Perfect. It was a great time, actually, Imran. It was a fascinating talk. So we really, really enjoyed it, and would love to actually have you on the show in the future again, once probably ASI is out, or maybe before then, or some other topic.
Sounds good. Thank you, Shadab. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again.
Ciao.
Bye.